It's a perfect overture, actually, to the discussion I want to have this evening, because the piece itself is harmonically unfinished, harmonically incomplete. It's starting in the key of C minor, and by the end, it's gone into the key of the dominant G major. And you might almost expect right after that to hear something like... C minor partita. So the little prelude is literally a prelude, something that comes before something else. In this case, it's a bit of a special one. I think it's a little prelude that comes before itself. Because it starts here and ends on the dominant, there's absolutely no reason why it couldn't start itself again. And that means that this, in a sense, is a perpetual prelude, a prelude that actually has no ending. I like to think of it in musical dimensions as having infinite life. It goes on forever. One of the reasons why I want to play it to start out as an overture for the last of these videos is because, in a sense, this is where my own interest in harmony began. The pieces that I've been playing, little musical excerpts here and there, are ones that I've chosen in part because they're relatively short and in a very concentrated way show some key ideas that we can pull apart. For the most part, none of those were ever in my repertoire. They're just things you pick up as a theory teacher to illustrate points along the way. But this piece, the little prelude in C minor, actually was something that once upon a time I practiced and played. And I still remember the first time I played it, I was 10 years old. I've been playing piano for a couple of years, and I was playing it for a kind of like house recital for students of my teacher, a woman who had the perfect piano teacher's name, Mrs. Upright. In any event, the piece, as you can tell, has a little bit of the character of an improvisation of some kind, like someone who's just kind of strumming chords and finding their way along. And given that improvisatory character, especially when you're young and you don't have too much knowledge of harmony, it's not that difficult to get lost in it. And indeed, the first time I performed it, I did. Now, fortunately, it has a very repetitive pattern, so it's a very forgiving piece in terms of improv. As long as you can find your way through harmonies, it's very easy to keep this thing rolling along without people particularly noticing. However, after I finished playing it and actually successfully brought it to a resolution in the correct key, G major, my teacher said to me afterwards, you played that quite nicely, but I think you took the improvisatory aspect a little too literally. So I realized then that I should start learning about harmony, what was actually going on in these pieces of music. So for me, this is kind of like my personal ground zero for harmony. However, it's a good place for us to conclude this video series with, because what we need to talk about are chords of the leading tone seventh, the triad, and the seventh, built on the seventh scale degree. And this is a piece that's just replete with them. So the first thing that I'm going to do is write a couple of chords that will come very easily out of this piece, as you can imagine, on the board. And we'll start to get a few ideas about things that can be done with the leading tone triad, the leading tone seventh chord. So this is a piece that obviously has a lot of harmonies in it. And unfortunately, many of the harmonies that Johann Sebastian Bach is using here are ones that technically I'm not supposed to be talking about in this particular course. Nonetheless, I wanted to focus on just a few key moments in it so that you get some sense of a way into the piece itself. And one of the things that really helps mark structure in this work is the use of chords built on the seventh scale degree, and the leading tone seventh in particular. If we look at the opening of it, I'm just giving a reduction that's showing just one of the hands. What you probably would have heard is that my left hand is also outlining triads for a large part of it. So if my right hand is doing this, the left hand is also playing a triad. I'm not going to show that just yet. That will be something interesting to take a look at in a moment. I just want to stop right here. If I looked at something like this pattern, of course, when I play that progression, I can hear a pedal tone that's being used. It's a little bit like Bach wants to keep things kind of tightly centered on the tonic C and the bass for the time being before he starts moving around. There's a huge pedal tone in the middle of the piece, which is this bit. It's built on D in the bass. That is the dominant of the dominant. And ultimately, at the very end of the piece, we'll have another pedal tone on G as the music moves toward an emphasis on the key of the dominant as its semi-concluding point. Of course, it doesn't really have that sense of a full ending behind it. In any event, if we look at something like this, what I notice straight away is I can, of course, start out providing myself with a conventional Roman numeral analysis of it. So tonic harmony to start out with. And right away, we might notice something interesting here that I promised to talk about at the end of my previous lecture. That is to say, the sixth type of 6/4 chord, the pedal tone 6/4 chord. I just briefly referred to it there. And here you can see how it very naturally grows out of the chord that precedes it, tonic harmony. The idea of the pedal 6/4 in this case, however, is a very specific one. In this case, it is the subdominant function 6/4 chord. So even if it is emerging out of a pedal tone, and we'll talk more about that over here, the idea is that it is preparing a move to some sort of dominant quality harmony. So if I play these two chords together, they are harmonious with whatever's in the bass. Where things go a bit awry is right at this point. So I'll play the first two chords. And this sounds rather like an error of some kind, except maybe not. It might remind us of that situation we had before in the Chopin B minor waltz, where Chopin was literally stating a dominant sonority, dominant seventh, over top of a tonic pedal tone. And that kind of tension between those two harmonic elements created the kind of impetus for the consequent answer that he was going to give us in that little period. Now, what we're having here is something similar. If I look at that by itself, it might look like in the key of C minor, something like this, dominant seventh, but with the root left out. If I have that just by itself, that would be a triad built on the seventh scale degree. We call it the leading tone seventh, whether we're in major or minor, in part because, as we already know, when you go into a minor key, you can often have seventh chords built on scale degree 7, but they're on the diatonic 7. Those are the ones where we talked about a flat 7, and what that meant really was a diatonic 7th. Technically then, if we're thinking about our symmetry, actually I'm worried that this might not be in camera frame, so I'll move that back over here. Remember, we have dominant above, subdominant below, mediating between the tonic and the dominant, submediant mediating between the tonic and the subdominant, and we can have the chord of the supertonic, and below that, actually I don't need that in this case. I'm just imagining things in C major for the moment. A subtonic. So the thing that's just above the tonic, the thing that's just below the tonic. I guess I could show more clearly that way. We tend to save that term for when we are in the minor key and using a diatonic 7th scale degree. But what we're specifically interested in is if I were in a minor key, like C minor, where I would understand there to be a B flat there unless I've notated otherwise with an accidental. If I'm doing that, just to make sure we're clear, we're calling it the leading tone, and because it uses the same kind of voice leading principles, a major or minor, we just refer to it as the leading tone, 7th chord. So that is what we can call this thing. Now, as you might guess, this component by itself is harmonically unstable because we have a diminished fifth built into it. Where we encountered that before, in particular, was when we were dealing with actually the chord of the supertonic. And the supertonic, actually, I'm just going to quickly check and make sure that's in view. Yes, it appears to be the case. Supertonic in a minor key is a diminished triad, and when we worked with that, we were very cautious because we had a triad that was, in a sense, dissonant with respect to itself because it had that diminished fifth. You might recall that we tended to double the third of the chord rather than the root or the fifth, because of the root or the fifth, we're emphasizing that dissonant interval. It could bring a certain harshness to the sonority of that chord. Conveniently, when we doubled the third, that made it seem more like a 4 chord with an added sixth. But we're going to apply the same idea for a leading tone triad. This likewise is a diminished triad. Conventional use, not always, but conventionally we double the third for the same reasons. And now one thing that we need to keep in mind is, of course, given where it is, given the fact that it's built on top of the leading tone, it clearly will have a dominant function, and in that sense might seem to be like a dominant seventh with the root removed. Sometimes that's the case, sometimes that is not the case. And what we're going to watch out for is the fact that if I'm dealing with a leading tone triad or a leading tone seventh, I have basically opposing voice leading models. In each case, I'm going to be talking about something and something else. The something will provide a context, a basic voice leading idea. In terms of the leading tone triad, it's going to be what we call the doubled element, which will be the third of the chord. In the case of the leading tone seventh chord, it's going to be the leading tone itself. So that will be the something. The something else will be what the other voices do. And what we will discover is that in the case of the leading tone triad, we want to think up, and when we're thinking about the leading tone seventh, we want to think down. So up versus down. There will be this basic divide in the voice leading models. And so one of these will seem to more naturally fit this idea of this behaving as though it were the upper part of a dominant seventh. But the other one, that will not be the case, because rather than having a seventh falling, we'll see it rising later on. Now, if I come back over here, by itself, of course, that looks like a leading tone triad. However, there is that left hand, and it's almost like Bach is imagining, okay, what it would be like to improvise something where each hand has a triad to play around with. It's not always a triad, but always we have 3 pitch classes in one hand and 3 in the other, right? And to start out with, they match each other perfectly. So this is a great way to practice the piece. But there's a shift right here. This one stays stuck in that place. And of course, because I'm in the key of C minor, this is doubling that. What that means is that I have this taking place. So we were introduced to the idea of seventh chords quite a few videos ago. I think it was probably in the first video in this series, which, of course, the series started up 2/3 of the way through the course, so we dove straight into things. But this is an example of a leading tone 7th chord, and if I left out the pedal tone, we do get that sense of a dominant function, and then we go back to this idea here. So now we can see how you can have what emerges as a pedal tone 6/4 chord, but turns into this subdominant function 6/4 chord, takes us to a dominant function harmony, and then resolves itself to the tonic. Now, these kinds of sevenths are used throughout the piece, and it's one way in which Bach really likes to emphasize going into especially the key of the dominant. So if I were taking up the piece from there, what I've done is go through a stepwise linear descent through the natural minor to what appears to be this position. And I should mention that there are ways in which one could analyze this further and say, oh yeah, it's a tonic 7th chord, and then it turns into a 6/7 chord, that sort of thing. The main idea, though, is to get me down toward what will sound like something like this. And what it does, rather than going directly to a 5/7 or a 5 chord and taking us back to 1, that's where Bach harmonically opens the gates. And instead what he moves to is this. And if I were to play that for you, all the notes combined, what you get in particular is our old friend 7/0/7 of, in this case, the key of the dominant. And then we go over here. I should mention, of course, that this is the implication, but when we are arriving here, something will shift, and that is, rather than going from this to that would resolve everything and keep things in the key of C minor. Instead, actually, speaking of taking a familiar old harmonic move and giving it new life, it's going to be 7/0/7 of the natural minor dominant, which would be a G minor sonority. I just want to remind us of one thing in particular here, though. The idea of a 7/0/7 of the dominant might be familiar to us. We have, let's see if I can get the voice leading back in my head. I'm just going to put in all the accidentals to remind us of what was being used there in Schumann's case, because that piece was in the key of G major. So imagine a single G major key signature being there. What happens is, so I'm putting in all the accidentals. Had this kind of resolution. And that was a 7/0/7 of 5, going to the 1 in the key of the dominant. And what's striking about that is we have these lovely parallel tenths that Schumann likes for his voice leading. Right there is a textbook resolution of a 7/0/7 chord, where we'll have a leading tone going up and everything else going down, 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 down. So that's that down model, okay? So that idea is something that Bach will bring back into play at the very end of the piece, but then he does a little bit of a bait and switch. He's been associating it with the key of the natural dominant, G minor, but at the very end, he suddenly decides to go to the original dominant idea, which would be a G major triad. He's going to give us that 707 once again, but resolve it to a major tonic. Now, what in the key of the dominant? So what I want to do next, this has just given us a few ideas to play around with. I want to now break it down the way I usually do. I'm going to put up some basic progressions for just the leading tone triad itself. We'll look at it just in a very conventional use to start out with, and in a pattern that will be very familiar to us by now. It's a basic pattern that we've harmonized a couple of different ways, and we'll have a third way to harmonize it now. And then we'll look at how we can use it to have a little bit more extended harmonic usage. And then after that, we'll come back to the 707 itself. So the first thing I'm going to show us is just a very basic voice leading pattern that we will have been reminded of even with our last video, the one on passing 6/4 chords. You might recall that the idea there was to prolong a harmony in an interesting way. And what it started out with was the idea of the use of a chord in first inversion as a way to kind of shake things up a bit, make things a little bit more interesting, and therefore setting in place a voice exchange. So I could do the same thing here. I'm in the key of E minor. I can imagine going 2, 1, 6. So the whole idea is to extend tonic harmony in some interesting way. And again, if I just held on to the opening triad, this would give me a doubled third. So I don't want to have that. What I want to look for is the possibility to avoid that by having a voice exchange. If this is going from E to G, do I have a G that could move down to an E? And I do right there. So same idea as before. We can always readily hear that voice exchange taking place. So in this case, I suppose I can show it once again. There it is. So bass part had the E and is passing it over to the ostensible tenor there. The tenor had the G, the third of the chord, and is passing over to the bass. So they exchange these components of the underlying harmony. And back again. And then you might remember this idea of putting in passing tones, like so. And what we've done before to actually harmonize that was to say, all right, if I was going between, say, I'll be consistent here since I'm in minor. If I was going from 1 to 1, 6, we looked at putting in a 5, 4, 3. That was one of those more unusual resolutions of a dominant seventh, because with the fifth rising in that case, we ended up with a doubled third in the conventional resolution of it. Going back down again, that wasn't any particular concern because it just returned itself to the original state. That's the fifth of the dominant seventh resolving as it actually should, going down by step, etc. The other thing that we learned there was that we could use the passing 6/4 going up or down. So we're adding a third possibility now, which is going to be this. Chord 7 in first inversion, and remember the idea of a triad built on scale degree 7, because it's diminished in quality, we want to double the third. The passing tone motion has already done that for us. So that crucial step is already done by the voice exchange and the idea of passing tone motion, because the fifth has been doubled as an organic outcome of that voice exchange. And then the only other things I need to pay attention to are the leading tone, the root of the triad, and the fifth. So here is the leading tone. Write it as though it were in one measure. And here's the fifth. Now, one thing I want to point out is that if this actually were part of a dominant seventh, the leading tone would be rising, the fifth would be falling because, not the fifth, that would be the seventh of the dominant seventh. But because it's the fifth of the leading tone triad, actually it goes up. So what I want you to notice is that in this case, the doubled element moves contrary in both cases. In this case, it's going down versus up. In this case, down versus up. So doubled element moves contrary, everything else moves up. And you'll get a sense of that because, of course, one part of the rest of the triad is the leading tone, and especially if it's an exposed voice, we want to hear that rising up. But the fifth of that chord also goes up. So this is why you can't just think of the leading tone triad as though it were a dominant seventh with the root cut off. It won't give you the correct voice leading. So here is what that will sound like. Because if you didn't do that, you'd end up with the doubled third, right? That would be going down, that would be going down, and that would thin out the sound. So here's the basic voice exchange. I put in the passing tones, and now I can harmonize them fully with 706. All right, same idea over here. I can see the possibility for voice exchange between bass and soprano, like so. Just as a reminder to myself, here is the exchange taking place. And then back again. That voice exchange sets up the possibility for passing tone motion, which will automatically double the third of 706. And then all I need to put in is the leading tone itself, which for convenience I'll still have resolving upwards by step, even if it's in an inside voice, and then the fifth of the chord. Oh, I forgot to actually fill in the rest of this interior harmony. It's already, I should do that so that you can see that it's already in place for the correct voice leading. And there we go, we're done. So, in this case, we started with passing tones, and now with 706 harmonizing the passing tones. Okay, now one thing to keep in mind is that we don't just have to do this in a minor key. It will sound just fine in the major key, and we can use precisely the same voice leading. So or sounds just great. Okay? As the textbook points out, we really don't have convincing use of this particular progression with the voice leading starting up on the fifth scale degree. Okay, if you were to come across something like that, technically what it should be doing is it just sounds a bit awkward and strange, so that doesn't get used. Now, what this is doing is not giving us a lot of harmonic range. Remember, the main idea is essentially prolongation of tonic harmony by a dominant function chord in the middle. And one question we might want to ask ourselves is, well, if this really is dominant function, surely there must be progressions where we have a subdominant function chord preceding it. And that's where we get into some very interesting voice leading models, and that's what I'll put up separately on the board next. We're back and we're looking at the leading tone triad, but this time, given its dominant function, we want to see what it's like if we approach it with subdominant function harmony. What I have done here is work from page 277, our examples there. I'm treating them a little bit out of order because I think the way they're given in the textbook, they're a little bit out of order. So you'll see that I'm dealing with A, B, C, and then E. C and E are actually derived from each other, as you'll be able to see from the melodic line that's there, and then I go to D. Examples F and G are just different versions, different ways of interpreting progression E, so we don't need to have that there. And one other thing, for some reason that I really don't understand, the first example is given in a different key than all of the others, so I just transposed it so that this is also in the key of D major. We can compare all of these side by side. So the first example is using subdominant harmony to approach 706. And although if I go from chord 4 to chord 7, we would recognize that to be progression by fifth, root progression by fifth. However, it won't look exactly the same as a progression 3 model because, of course, what we're doing is root progression by fifth, but the second chord is not doubling the root. So the voice leading will be a little bit different. So that's what we have here. I'll just play that for you. So that's a very standard progression, and what we can see here is, of course, we have the doubled element moving contrary and everything else moving upward. So that's a very standard resolution for 706. I mention that right now because later on we'll be getting to non-standard resolutions, easily approached by chord 4, and away you go. What we're doing here is substituting chord 2, also subdominant function chord. What's it like if we go from 2 to 706? Now, one thing I want to point out here is that the use of major mode is significant because, remember, in that case, we're dealing with a supertonic chord that's just minor in quality. It's not diminished in quality, so we're not thinking about doubling the third, all right? The other thing for us to notice is that because we're dealing with it in root position, it maps on directly to 706. I mean, they share the same note in the bass, and in fact, there's so much common tone activity that the only thing that's shifting around is the fifth of chord 2 is turning into the third of chord 706. So that progression sounds like this. So compare the first two. And again, we have the doubled element moving contrary, everything else moving up, standard resolution. So two standard resolutions of 706, both approached by subdominant function harmony. Now things will get a little bit more interesting in terms of the voice leading with example C. The first thing I want to do is actually just play that for you so that you can hear it. So once again, I'm going to bring out a couple of voices. Now the first thing I'd like you to notice is that when I brought out particular voices, it was the outer voices, soprano and bass. And also notice that for the first time we've shifted from keyboard scoring to vocal scoring because of some funny stuff that happens later on. What I was emphasizing, what I'll emphasize now by taking out the inner voices, is there's an underlying linear model that's driving this progression. Those are parallel tenths. So that's the idea here. And you might remember 10, 10, 10. That we ran across this idea before when we considered a final version of the Pachelbel progression. When we were talking about the use of mediate and submediate harmonies, we had right? That progression was one where, because the most important thing was having parallel tenths in the bass and soprano, we could bypass certain norms of voice leading. Here we have our first non-standard. That's what the NS means there. I've just written that in to help us keep track of this. So the overriding idea is parallel tenths between bass and soprano. So we have this lovely 5-4-3 descent in the soprano line being mirrored by 3-2-1 in the bass. We are therefore moving from 1-6 to 1. Okay, the textbook left out the 6, but it's significant that we're going from 1-6 down to 1. And then as we move from chord 2 to 7-0-6 here, it's the kind of thing that we have done before. But what I want us to notice here is, because the idea is to have the parallel tense going downwards like so, this means that the fifth of 7-0-6 in this case is actually descending for the first time, okay? And what that means is that if everything else moved up, we'd end up with a doubled third, making tonic harmony sound a bit thin. So what we get is this doubled element actually not moving contrary, it's moving in the same direction, but this voice is leaping underneath that one. So that's a voice crossing, and this is one of those particular cases where it's merited. Okay, so this is from 1-6 to 1. What if we flip that around? That's what we're getting in example E, moving from 1 to 1-6. And again, the stepwise motion in the bass between scale degrees 1, 2, and 3 is something that almost begs to have that kind of harmonization, if it's possible, of tonic, subdominant, switching over to 7-0-6 to back to tonic again, whether I'm going up to 1-6 or down from 1-6 down to 1. 2 turning into 7-0-6 is such a conventional move. And what we have here that's also non-standard is we have the fifth being doubled. Now, despite that, there's still the kind of paradigm of the standard leading tone triad voice leading model where the doubled element moves contrary and everything else moves up. So I'll play that progression for you. And then what you'll notice at the end of it, it sounds a little bit churchy, I would say. We are ending up with a doubled third in 1-6. Why? Well, it seems as though if the underlying linear idea here was parallel tense descending, in this case, we've got two lines converging toward each other. So a sense of contrary motion converging on scale degree 3, like so. So it's kind of nice in the sense that if you're looking for contrapuntal distinctions between parts, contrary motion is always a good thing to reach for, as we know. It's a kind of progression that Bach likes to use a great deal. So we went from 1-6 down to 1, 1 up to 1-6. The last progression that we are looking at here is just another way to see a non-standard resolution of 7-0-6 to 1, also with a doubled fifth. So that's what the 2 times fifth means, that we're doubling the fifth. In this case, however, we're not following the same idea of doubled element moving contrary and everything else moving up. We actually have things quite mixed up. I mean, we do have the doubled element moving contrary, but the other parts are moving contrary too. And one of the reasons for that is to try to come up with a complete triad for chord 1 at the end. So underneath this passage, what we have is the guidance of voice exchange once again. And we have passing motion filling that in, okay? So I'll play that one for you. Okay? All right, so these are standard variations on the use of 7-0-6 when it is preceded by subdominant function harmony. And as I mentioned before, you'll hear this a ton in Bach chorales. So what we haven't looked at yet is the fuller possibility for the leading tone chord. That is to say, to extend it up to its seventh. And this is getting back to our interest in diminished sevenths. That's the next part of this discussion that I'll take a look at. We'll look at a standard resolution first, and then we will look at inversions of the diminished seventh. But in fact, the first thing I always like to do is play for us a whole series of diminished sevenths both in root position and in various inversions, and see if we can actually hear any difference between them. And the reason why I do that is because there's something very special about a diminished seventh that we have not encountered in a seventh chord yet. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to show us is the standard resolution for a diminished seventh. In particular, we're going to be focusing on a minor key, although I'll talk about extensions to major. Remember, if we're in a major key, say G major, what we have is a half diminished seventh being produced on 7th scale degree. It's if we're in minor that we get the diminished seventh. And there's a reason why we want to be careful about the distinction. I'll talk about that in a moment. The other thing to remember is that I was comparing the use of the LeadingTone Triad and the LeadingTone seventh as essentially opposite voice leading models. So for the LeadingTone Triad, there's a double element, it moves contrary, and then everything else moves up. In the case of the LeadingTone seventh chord, what you're thinking about is the fact that the leading tone itself goes up and everything else goes down. So the LeadingTone Triad, there's something and then everything else moves up. In the case of the LeadingTone seventh chord, there's something, the leading tone, which goes up, everything else goes down. So that's exactly what we see in the standard voice leading model. The leading tone rising and everything else moving down. And remember, because it's a seventh chord, ordinarily speaking, it's going to be complete, and also there'll be no doublings necessary. So I'll just play the standard A version for us, the B version, and I'm also going to give you a C version that isn't in the textbook, which, as you can hear, sounds absolutely fine. It looks like parallel fifths, but of course it's not perfect parallel fifths, and that's what we're concerned with, perfect parallels. Now, the reason why you're not given an example C is because, as usual in the textbook, they want to provide a voice leading model that will work whether in major or minor. I don't think it's problematic for us to make a mental note that, oh, if I happen to be in major, there might be something I can't do. These models will work for both major and minor. So the minor version for A in major is fine enough. The B version in minor and major, that actually sounds quite nice. What would sound lousy is the C version in major. It sounds horrible to my ear, and it would sound even worse again if there were sustained voices or instruments playing those parallel fifths. So C only in minor. Now, if we turn to applications of this outside of just 1, 707 back to 1 again, specifically what we're interested in is what happens when you introduce a subdominant function chord before it. You have this longer progression, which I'll play for you right now. And the first thing I want us to notice is that whatever model we've learned here is being applied throughout here. Always a 707 to 1, we see the leading tone rising, everything else falling, okay? Now, of course, as a longer progression, this doesn't necessarily sound great. It's not really intended to be heard as a longer progression. It's just trying to show us different ways in which we can precede the diminished seventh with subdominant harmony. What's not so obvious in the progression is the symmetry behind it. If you look at just what's written in the treble clef in the middle two measures, you'll see that is identical. And then there's something else that you can see behind the scenes if you look at the outer measures. If you cut out the middle harmony, you'll see the voice leading from 1 to 707 is exactly the same. The only thing that's being changed is the middle harmony In one case is 2 half diminished 4/2, in the other case is 1/6. So what I would recommend for getting to know these things is to play this and that after each other, and then this and that after each other. So what you're hearing is the same basic framework for tonic harmony and the 7/0/7, and then something shifting in between. In this case, it's just a bass part. Here, rather than going for 2 half diminished 4/2, actually, that should be, no, that's correct, of course, because we're in a minor key. And over here, 1/6. So that's the typical extending tonic harmony by 1/6. So I'll play this, these middle two measures first. Okay, so in the first case, that was with subdominant harmony, and then with supertonic seventh. Very nice chord quality, that 2 half diminished seventh. Now if I compare the outer ones, I'm playing it almost as though it were a suspension. So that's that characteristic 2 half diminished 4/2, almost sounding like it turns into a suspension of some kind, where before we were resolving from that to 5/6/5 chord. Now instead we can treat the C sharp as the root of a 7/0/7, and of course 1 to 1/6 in the penultimate measure. But in the first and penultimate measures, the framing voice leading is 1 going to 7/0/7 and back again. That is to say, this progression right here. Okay, so the last thing that we need to look at is the use of 7/0/7 in inversions. And there's going to be something very interesting about that. Yes, of course, we can have the same kinds of figured bass applied there that we do for dominant 7. So first inversion, 6/5, second inversion, 4/3, third inversion, 4/2. That's familiar to us, but it's going to be a little bit different. It's actually really easy to hear inversions of dominant 7s. For some odd reason, it really isn't when we listen to inversions of 7/0/7, and I'll prove that to you in just a moment. What might not be so clear is the sound quality and distinctions between inversions of 7/0/7. So what I'm going to do is play 8 diminished sevenths, and each one is different from the others. Now, if you were listening carefully, what you should have heard was a root position diminished seventh on C sharp, a first inversion diminished seventh on A sharp, the root is A sharp, a second inversion diminished seventh with the root of G, a third inversion diminished seventh with the root of E, also a root position diminished seventh in the key of D minor, a first inversion diminished seventh in the key of B minor, a second inversion diminished seventh in the key of A flat minor, and finally a third inversion diminished seventh in the key of F minor. So 8 different chords. Problem is I can't hear a difference between any of them. Now, of course, what this is doing is emphasizing the fact that the diminished seventh is quite special. It's a perfectly symmetrical sonority. So wherever I am, the next chord element is just a minor third or 3 semitones up from the last one. trying to hang on to these things. So if I were to go through rotations of this, each of these things has the same interval structure, minor third, minor third, minor third, minor third, minor third, minor third. That would not change. If this had been a dominant seventh, when you go through inversions, they sound appreciably different from each other. It really does sound like a remixing up of the interval quality. So dominant sevenths versus diminished sevenths. I mean, it's one reason why I find, for example, from the good old days of teaching piano, when students would have to play their diminished seventh chords in inversions, often they would lose track of where they'd started, just because how can you tell the difference from one to the next? So what that means is that even though we still have the same kinds of designations for inversions of diminished sevenths, 707, 7065, 7043, 7042, it's not always that easy to hear them. So for that reason, diminished sevenths tend to be a little bit of a shape-shifting sonority. Now, the example that we have that's making use of diminished sevenths in inversions, for the most part, sticks with standard resolutions, which you can see there. I'll play the whole passage for you so that you can hear it. So I think one of the non-standard resolutions obviously stands out right away, because we've got an interest in moving to 1/6, doubling the fifth to finally have a little bit more of an open sound quality. I mean, as you can tell here, diminished sevenths can get a little bit claustrophobic. It's nice to be able to resolve them in some way, in this case having a leap up in the melody to a chord 1/6, where of course we have the option of doubling the fifth. So that non-standard resolution stands out. I want to look at the standard ones for a moment. The whole idea being going that here, of course, we can see the leading tone rising, everything else falling. If I look at the standard ones, that's what I'm seeing happening. The leading tone goes up, everything else falls. There's the leading tone in the soprano part. It's going up, everything else falls. Over here, the leading tone rises, everything else falls. Here, at least the leading tone does rise. What makes it non-standard is that particular leap. And of course, at the very end, leading tone rising, everything else falls. So it's that same basic voice leading model, and in that sense, much less complicated to work with, I suppose, than dominant sevenths. However, we do have one significant change, and that is here. Remember that when we have a 5-6-5 chord, for example, that means typically leading tone in the bass, it's exposed, it must go up by step. And of course, the basic voice leading model for the 707, the third of that is one of the components that goes down by step. So that's why typically 7065 goes down. However, note once again this characteristic movement from 1 to 1/6. We learned about going between 1 and 1/6 using a passing 6/4, using 5/4/3. Most recently, earlier in this video, we learned about using the leading tone triad to do that, 706. Well, actually, you can also use 7065 to do the same thing. And again, here what that's going to result in is first inversion tonic harmony with a doubled fifth. But in a sense, does it really matter? I mean, it's hard to hear a distinction in the voice leading between 7065 down to 1 and 7065 up to 1/6. My ear isn't offended by the third of the chord going up or down. And I think it has everything to do with the underlying supersymmetry of this chord. And by the way, the only other chord that has that kind of symmetry for us was, if you recall, that we were looking at the use of 3 augmented in a minor key, C minor. And that also, to the ear at least, even if it visually doesn't look like it, is a stacking of the same, I would say,
sound of the third. Of course, it looks like diminished fourth, but it's a stacking of what I would hear in equal temperament as major thirds. Okay, so 707 and the augmented mediant in a minor key have that symmetrical character to them, such that it's hard to hear inversions of them, especially taken out of a particular musical context. Now, there's just one other thing that I would like to remind us of, and that is that we can do all sorts of things that will make a piece of music more interesting if we consider the possibility of modal mixture. By that, I mean pretending that you've gone into the parallel mode for a moment or two. We talked about that before in different contexts. I could give you another one, Schubert's Arpeggione Sonata. If I were to play it in a way that I might write it, going from 1 to 1, 6, 4, 2, 6, 4, 5, 7, 1. Sounds nice enough. What Schubert actually writes is it's the middle movement of the arpeggione. It's 1, and instead of going directly to 1, 6, he actually has a secondary diminished seventh going to chord 2 in first inversion, and then instead of repeating chord 2, he, in the major key, he imagines he goes for a moment into the parallel minor. That's a lovely little example that reminds us of the idea of a secondary dominant or dominant function chord of some kind. The use of modal mixture. A very popular use of diminished sevenths is actually in a major key. And I'll give you a little example of that. This is from a piece by Tchaikovsky called The Morning Prayer. There is a pedal tone with a diminished seventh parked on top of it. I'm in a major key, I'm in the key of G major, but Tchaikovsky thinks it's really important to pretend for the moment as though he's gone into G minor, so we get that diminished seventh sound quality. It's a very typical move. We also heard it a little bit in Scott Joplin. And that's about as much as I should play because I'll probably get the copyright police on me yet again. YouTube is a little bit busy these days, and the content bots that they send around to the various uploads kind of show us how artificial non-intelligence is working these days. In any event, that use of a diminished seventh that sounds like it's coming from a minor key, but then exploding into a lovely major sonority is a very typical thing to encounter in music. So that's looking again at possibilities for the diminished seventh. I know I've been talking about them in all of these examples in terms of a minor key. Actually, then a lot of this kind of voice leading can be used in a major key if you want to use modal mixture. So the last thing that I want to do is just play a final little piece of music for us. Just to wrap things up, and I'm going to take it from the Tchaikovsky Morning Prayer I just played for you. So I'd like to end this video series just with a heartfelt thanks to my son, Arkady. He's someone who helped me get into the digital age, as of course our kids tend to do. He taught me about having a YouTube channel and how to make these kinds of videos on iPhone, edit them at a
very basic level, in my case in iMovie. So really, Arkadiy's help has been absolutely essential to me getting these videos put together and produced as quickly as possible under the circumstances. So I really want to thank him. The last thing that I want to play for us is that Tchaikovsky morning prayer that you heard just a little excerpt of in the last segment of discussion. There are a couple of reasons for that. A lot of the time I've been playing pieces that are kind of stretching beyond what standard voice leading models sound like. I didn't want things that sounded like more textbook examples. However, sometimes it's also nice just to hear things that were intentionally written in a nice 4-part harmonic style. And also music that doesn't necessarily follow the voice leading models themselves. A lot of the times in this course, we've been focusing on chord functionality to kind of drive or frame our harmonic progressions. And that has meant basically we've been sticking with overall the tonic, subdominant, dominant, tonic function progression model. However, Tchaikovsky's morning prayer is something that frequently turns out completely backwards, and it sounds great. And so I think that's a particularly important example for us to hear as we leave this video series and as we leave